Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast is sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. In 1917, with Paul von Lettow Vorbeck's forces fighting a desperate guerrilla campaign in East Africa and supplies running dangerously low, the German Navy proposed an almost unbelievable solution. They would send a single airship from Bulgaria on a nonstop, one-way mission across the Mediterranean, over enemy territory and deep into the African interior. It was one of the most daring and least known operations of World War I. To help us explore the story of the Africa ship, we're delighted to welcome historian and author Dominic Etzold, author of The Africa Ship, Ludwig Blockholt, Zeppelin L-59, and the most daring rescue mission of World War I. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much for having me.
To start, can you give us an overview of airships in World War I? What were they like? And how did their roles evolve during the war?
Sure. So very few people know that Ferdinand von Zeppelin came up with the idea of airships, rigid airships, based on experiences in the American Civil War, where he was a foreign observer. So the original intention of airships was to observe enemy artillery, scouting, and that was the original concept. In World War I, at the beginning of it, they were very primitive, but they sort of deviated between how they were used between the Army and Navy. Both originally used them for reconnaissance. The Army then wanted more frontline support with carrying bombs and armaments, attacking targets on the ground. The Navy, for the most part, remained in fleet cooperation, searching for mines, long-distance reconnaissance, and eventually they, too, began making raids on England, not nearly as much as the British would have you believe. It was sort of an unusual operation, only happened maybe once every month or so in the new moon period. But they too got in with the bombing of targets on the ground.
So I've heard that airship crews sometimes are compared to a cross between submariners and then early pilots. Do you think that's true?
Submariners, definitely. Pilots, a little bit less so. You have to think of airships as almost traveling in a sea of air. You have to deal with buoyancy. You have to carry ballast. Once you have buoyancy, you're using what they call dynamic lift, is using the power of the engines and then the planes on the elevator to sort of raise or lower the airship, which is exactly how a submarine would work. A submarine would take on water until it had equilibrium with the actual water, and then would use the engines and then bow planes or stern planes to move around. And that's pretty much how Zeppelins worked. Less aerial pilots, but they did have to deal with the same problems that aerial pilots did, as far as different temperatures and currents within the airstream that really nobody knew about at the time. And a lot of this was figured out on these long-distance Zeppelin runs and what they call the height climbers. Once they started getting above 15,000 feet into 20,000 feet, all these new problems that nobody ever realized with the air. But the submariner comparison is a very good one that actually I hadn't heard until you posed that question.
Now, in your book, you discuss some of the rivalry between the German Army and Navy when it comes to the use of airships. Can you tell us a little bit about the argument between them, and does either side win?
Yes. So I would say there is a clear winner, but to go back to the beginning of the war, there were very few airships available to split both between the Army and Navy. They were very expensive, about $13 to $14 million to make one in today's money. It took months to do. And they both had very varying roles for them. Like I said, the Army sort of wanted to attack ground targets, support the front line. The Navy needed them for reconnaissance. One thought one mission was more important than the other. And they were fighting over the delivery of airships. At one point, when the topic of raiding England came up, the Army said, we want to do it, and we want all of the airships that you were supposed to get and all of your crews to then join the Army. In fact, Ernst Lehmann, a very famous airship commander both during and after the war. He was involved with the commercial Zeppelin flights after the war. He was actually a naval officer in the reserve, but he was requisitioned by the Army. So his commercial airship became an Army asset. And even though he had a rank with the Navy, pretty much was serving with the Army throughout the war. Um, as the war went on, the attrition rate for the Army was pretty terrible. Their tactics were not nearly as advanced as that of the Navy, due to Peter Strasser in the Navy. He really understood the airships. He really understood the best ways to utilize them. The Army didn't really have any similar person in that role that had that sort of understanding. So by February of 1917, the Army gave up airship operations entirely. The remaining airships that they had were then given to the Navy, primarily used for scouting duties, and the Navy carried on with airship use both for reconnaissance and raids right until the end of the war. So I would say the Navy was the clear winner in this. They also had a much better training program. They got better resources. Hugo Eckner, who worked for the Zeppelin factory, actually trained the naval pilots. The naval pilots similarly had a bigger role in determining airship development. So I would say the Navy was the clear winner in this respect.
And it seems as though the Kaiser had a role or an opinion, at least in all of this too, didn't he?
Sure, the Kaiser ultimately had the final say on everything, and really a topic for a whole other podcast. The Navy was his baby. Really, Germany is a landlocked country except for the North and Baltic Sea. There was no need to have a major navy. The Kaiser really promoted this idea of a navy that he wanted to supersede the Royal Navy. And at the time of World War I, the Navy was the second largest in the world. It needed it. Really for the widespread colonies that they had, but the Kaiser was the one really pushing for naval development, and in a way, I guess he favored that even with the airships.
Interesting. So, can you give us a sense of Germany's situation in 1917, both in Europe and then in East Africa, that's going to come into play in terms of our talk today?
Sure. So in Europe, as we know, the Western Front was pretty much at a standstill. You had trench warfare. Nobody was really making significant gains on either side. In the Eastern Front, by this point, there were significant gains being made, and Russia was nearly out of the war. So Operation Albion took place in October of 1917, and that was sort of the final blow against the Russian Empire, and then they could divert resources back to Europe. So around the same time, the China Saka, the China Matter mission where L-59 went to Africa, it was Germany's biggest chance to sort of make big gains on the Western Front, redirect all the resources for the East, and it could have been a major turning point of the war. In Africa, that was not the case. So Germany lost just about every single one of its colonies, both in Asia and in Africa in 1914. Germany East Africa was the only one to hold out, and they only had about 6,000, they called them protection troops, a Schutztruppe, to defend the colony against over 100,000, 120,000 Allied troops. By 1917, they were making a perpetual retreat toward the southern border on the Rovuma River along the border with Mozambique, as the Allies continued to occupy the coastline and were making ingresses from both the north and the west. So the Schutztruppe was essentially surrounded except on the southern area, in which they were retreating toward Portuguese Mozambique. They lost almost the entire ability to resupply by sea. They had no rail access to anything, and they sort of had to raid and pillage in order to resupply themselves at this point.
So, who suggests the very audacious mission to resupply them? And was it really even something that was possible? I mean, were the capabilities and technology there to actually make this successful?
All right, so there were the Reichskolonialamt, the Imperial Colonial Department, was taking suggestions from anyone at this point in the war to aid in the relief of German East African troops. A lot of proposals were coming in for submarines, blockade breakers, etc. But there was a figure, Max Zupitza. He was a colonial doctor. He served in both German East Africa and German Southwest Africa, where he's ultimately captured in the beginning of the war. He was repatriated to Germany in a prisoner exchange and actually was serving on the Eastern Front just in a medical capacity per his parole. And he was reading an article in the Vilnius Zeitung that is in occupied Vilnius, concerning potential Zeppelin usage. And they were saying that as the Zeppelin technology progressed, it would eventually be able to travel all the way to the United States. So he sent a proposal to the Reichskolonialamt saying, look, maybe we could use a Zeppelin to do this. The technology seems like it might be there. And only the Navy took it seriously. It went to the Army first. They ruled it out right at the beginning. They didn't think it was possible. They didn't want to get involved with it. The Navy, on the other hand, said, this is interesting, but we're going to shelve it right now. And then Ernst Lehmann and LZ-120, again, an Army asset, at this point in the war was just flying reconnaissance missions in the Baltic, given that the Army had given up operations and they were working for the Navy. He decided that he would try to experiment keeping his Zeppelin afloat for over 100 hours, which is about the time the article that Max Pizza read said it would take to reach the United States. So he said it was stupid to just do these missions back and forth, where most of the time is just traveling to the patrol area and then heading back. We should put a lot of fuel in this, a lot of supplies, and just keep the Zeppelin aloft as much as we can. So he wound up staying aloft for 101 hours. He found he still had many, many, many hours. I think it was 37 more hours of travel available with the fuel he had when he landed, and said this is very much possible with the technology that we have right now. So once that happened, the Navy reevaluated the whole project and said, wow, we really can make it to Africa, and started taking it very seriously with the technology that existed. The problem with the Navy was that there was no way to resupply an airship with hydrogen or fuel or any other supplies. So they anticipated just having this a one-way journey to East Africa, where they would then cannibalize the airship, where the girders would become wireless towers, the canvas would become bandages, the bladders that were used to store the gas cells could become waterproof clothing, etc. So it's very much possible. They just needed somebody to sort of make the initial attempt at proving the concept.
So once the decision is made to launch this very daring mission, how do they select the crew? Was this a voluntary sort of situation? And what can you tell us about the commander and crew?
It was ultimately, they had ideas for who they wanted to do it. But ultimately, those candidates and their crew would have to volunteer themselves. Initially, von Butler-Brandenfels, a very, very successful, very famous Zeppelin commander, was selected for the job. And then ultimately, Peter Strasser, the FDL, the leader of the airship, said, no, he's too valuable to us here. We want to go with somebody else. So Ludwig Blockholt and his crew, they were formerly on Zeppelin L-23, made a daring capture of a Norwegian bark on the sea, but for the most part, flew reconnaissance missions, fleet support, searching for mines. They had about 35 flights under their belt by the time they were eventually approached by Peter Strasser to do this mission. I think Blockholt is sort of treated unfairly by a few other historians that thought maybe he was utilized because he was expendable. He didn't have a terrible amount of experience. They thought, this is a guy we can get rid of. It's not going to be much of a loss. I don't think that's a fair assessment. Peter Strasser even said he had never made a raid on England later on. However, at the time he was chosen for this mission, he already flown 35 scouting missions and was being awarded command of a height climber airship that was intended to raid England. So had he not partaken in this mission, his next mission would have likely have been a raid on England. So I wouldn't say he was expendable. He was experienced. He was destined to join the ranks of von Butler-Brandenfels, but ultimately he had to sign up, volunteer, and any crew would have volunteered for this. Von Butler's crew did, unanimously wanted to go on this, as did Blockholt's. Originally, the Africa ship was going to be the airship L-57, which Blockholt sort of was responsible for destroying in an accident. And once that happened, Strasser actually considered finding new crews because there was no shortage of crews wanting to do this mission. And ultimately, the Navy decided, no, we're going to keep Blockholt and his crew. They're the most familiar with it, and they're going to take care of it. So again, I think he was treated in a way unfairly. I think he was experienced enough, and his contemporaries did actually praise him as an experienced and skillful commander after the war.
So walk us through the mission. How does it unfold?
The concept was to find the most southern base that they could to shorten the distance from it, which in this case was Yambol, Bulgaria. It was a former army airship base that they had since abandoned when they gave up airship operations. It was not in the best condition, so the Navy had to spend a lot of money to sort of bring it up to speed and get all the equipment they needed for this mission. And then the idea was to fly from Bulgaria with an airship loaded only with supplies. It had no means of defending itself. It had no machine gun nests. It had no bombs available. It was strictly a supply airship to then fly over the Ottoman Empire, across the Mediterranean, and then into Africa, tracing the Nile all the way through Sudan, and then eventually into German East Africa. It was super secret, although British intelligence did in fact sort of discern what was happening through spies and intelligence. But nonetheless, nobody got in the way of the airship on the way down. As I said before, it was initially supposed to happen with airship L-57, which was destroyed in an accident over Jüterbog in Germany along the way when it was on the way to Bulgaria. A lot to be said about that. I don't want to take up too much time describing that. But then they had to use L-59 for the same mission. And there were two aborted attempts due to weather and then other problems on the way, such as Turkish ground forces firing at the Zeppelin, because they weren't aware that a German airship was actually supposed to be flying over their territory. That's how secret the mission was. So they fired at it. L-59 had to return because it was leaking so much hydrogen. And then the German Navy was actually forced in a way to start sharing intelligence, to start warning people that, look, we're going to do this again. Don't fire at us. We're expecting a German airship. And it made it on its way. I don't want to give away too much. I don't know how deep you want me to go with this.
No, you don't have to give away the whole book. But what is the ultimate fate of L-59?
Sure. So as far as the African mission, L-59 was over the Sudan near Khartoum when it received a message to turn around. The message was based on intercepted Allied intelligence that said von Lettow and the Schutztruppe basically gave up their foothold in German East Africa and crossed the Rovuma River into Portuguese Mozambique. Now, that was true. That represented actual conditions on the ground. By the time L-59 would have landed in German East Africa in Mahenge, the Schutztruppe was gone. There was nobody to relieve. It would have ultimately have been captured or destroyed because the Allied forces were already there. So when they got the call to return, there was almost a mutiny on board because so many officers wanted to proceed with the mission. Blockholt, as a soldier, said, "These are my orders. This is what I have to abide by." And they returned and made it safely back to Yambol, Bulgaria. Back in Bulgaria, Blockholt started having all these ideas on how to utilize L-59 in that theater of war instead of returning to the Western Front and the North Sea. So he ran some mine-searching missions. He was in contact with the Mediterranean Division, who started proposing these ideas about flying to Yemen to support the Ottoman Empire. But ultimately, Blockholt wanted to convert the Zeppelin to an offensive weapon, so no longer being just a cargo vessel, but adding bomb bays. And then he sort of came up with this plan to open up a whole new front on the southern front in the Mediterranean against Italy, against North Africa. Strasser fought against that. Ultimately, Blockholt won out. So L-59 made raids on Italy. They made raids on North Africa. And on what became the final raid, it was lost. It was destroyed. No allies took credit for the destruction, which leads you to believe that something happened internally, and that's the hypothesis that I push. It made a lot of sense based on Blockholt's own records with problems that his airship was having during the Africa journey afterward, and some other airships, including L-53, that were having fuel line problems. A German submarine, SM UB-53, was actually on a mission within the Mediterranean and witnessed the destruction of L-59. It was flying so low that he thought it might be an Allied airship that was coming to bomb him, but then saw the German crosses on it and watched it disappear into the distance, where it then exploded. There was a sort of recovery operation afterward to try to find any trace of it, both with the U-boat, with Austro-Hungarian seaplanes, and the German Navy. And there was no trace of it. So L-59 was lost without a trace. And by all indications, it seems that it suffered a problem with a fuel leak and then caught fire.
A very, very tragic ending for commander and crew. Now, your book mostly focuses on, obviously, L-59 and this German airship. Were there other nations, though, also using airships during the war?
Yes. Italy fielded quite a few. I don't have the number offhand, but they put rigid airships into service. The Austro-Hungarian Navy shot down a few of those. England and France had their own airships, not really for the same purposes that Germany used them for, mostly just for reconnaissance, was really the ideal way to utilize them. They were not nearly as advanced as any of the German airships. In fact, British airships that were already being developed were their designs were suddenly changed when airship L-33 crashed in England, and they were sort of able to reverse engineer the structure. So L-33 became almost the catalyst for all the British airships that were built after the war, of which one crossed the Atlantic, even going to Long Island. That was all based on German technology. Nothing they had during the war really compared to or was able to do anything like that.
Okay.
After the war, multiple airships actually were given up as war reparations to both Italy, France, England, and even the United States, in which the Zeppelin factory actually built an airship and flew it over to be used by the United States.
Okay, interesting. Any final thoughts?
No, just thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Is the book out yet?
Yes, as of today, the book is out everywhere. Amazon started shipping it a while back, but now everybody else has caught up.
And thank you very much for joining us today. And the book is The Africa Ship, Ludwig Blockholt, Zeppelin L-59, and the Most Daring Rescue Mission of World War I. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.